Hey, Andy, thank you for joining. How are you?
Hi. Hi, I'm well. I'm well.
Thank you for joining all the
It's
way
nice
from
and warm
Antigua
here in
and
Antigua.
taking time out of your busy day to spend some time with us today. As you know, with our podcast channel and what we try to share with our listeners, we always want to talk about interesting people, important people that I know, such as yourself, and talk about their journey and how where life has taken them to where they are today. And you, my friend, have had a very interesting, cool, kind of like just a very successful journey of just things that were unexpected, expected, and then pushing through, trials and tribulations. And there's a lot of work behind the scenes a lot of people don't know about. But I'd like people to know more about, your journey, what you're all about, what got you to do what you're doing today.
Well, I think a lot of entrepreneurial stuff, you do a lot of joining the dots backwards, and it all sounds like it was planned, whereas I think most people, it wasn't planned. They just come up with the bullshit later when they sound like they joined the dots forwards. I don't think anyone joins the dots forwards. Everyone starts telling their story about how clever they were by joining the dots backwards. But now, kind of looking backwards, I mean, one of the first things that I think had an impact on my life was I was the son of an immigrant. And so my dad left South Africa with 6 kids and had the kind of gumption, I suppose, to get out there and change country and move to a completely alien culture, kind of find his way through this alien culture. And when I left university, I went and joined an oilfield services company and went off and worked in 8 different countries. He also went to war when he was 17. He was a tank driver with the South African army. So he'd had experience of going out and traveling, and then in his 30s he left South Africa with 6 kids. So I'm one of 8. So there's that kind of in the genes, I suppose, that desire to go out and see the world. And so I ended up working for a company called Schlumberger straight after university and worked in France and then Spain and then Aberdeen in Scotland, but then went into South America to Colombia. I worked in Colombia and then Peru and then Brazil and then came back to Libya. So I was working in the Sahara Desert and then went to Milan. I got married after Libya, went to Milan with my new wife. And then after a couple of years in Milan, could see that the future with that business was ever changing countries and not much change in the job. But that kind of gave me exposure to lots of cultures and exposure to lots of different ways of doing things. So I then did finance. I did an MBA and then did finance for 15 years in London. And just before you started, we were talking about, well, how did I get to be owning a hotel in Antigua? And it was completely by chance. But I suppose I was prepared to even have the idea that I could go and do it and what I thought I was going to do was invest some money in someone else's project with rather like a venture capital hat on. But the investment would give me a 2-bedroom villa. Being the Caribbean, nothing ever works quite the way you expect it to work. And it's probably true in life. It doesn't necessarily, I mean, it's probably true anywhere you try and do anything entrepreneurial. It doesn't quite work out the way you planned. But I think in the Caribbean, it just makes things much more, the path from A to B is always much more complicated and humorous most of the time along the way. You can look back and laugh about it. But I did start off thinking that I was going to be an investor in this hotel project. When I heard about it from the guy that worked for me, we had a holiday booked in Barbados. So I thought I'd go across from Barbados to Antigua to meet his dad, who was the main guy, and talk to him and see what the project was. And I came over and went all around the island, looked at all the hotels, went to this fantastic beach in the middle of nowhere and thought, yeah, this is great. I'd love a villa here. And I thought I was going to end up kind of swanning out every now and then, staying in my villa and, hi, I'm one of the owners, aren't I brilliant kind of thing. And of course, it didn't work out like that at all. But that was the beginnings of it. Going back to my point about joining the dots backwards, I had worked in the Sahara Desert with Libyan local workforce and I'd worked in the Amazon jungle. So it's kind of like, well, working in Colombia or working in Antigua, it's not that different. You have to be able to adapt. And I think if you ask me what was actually the guy who worked for me, who's my partner in the early days, his dad, he said to me a couple of years ago, he said, "I hope I didn't lead you into something you've regretted all your life." And I said, "No, not at all. It's the best thing I ever did." And I think on reflection, why was it the best thing I'd ever did? It was because of the people and the relationships I had with them and the culture that we created together, which became a hugely successful hotel. And it was about the kind of the quality of the service. So I wasn't really focused on financial success by the time we'd got halfway through the project, halfway through the lifetime of the project with me, which was we started in about 2005 and I sold it in 2000 and must have been 22, 23. It was like 15 years or whatever. So the main thing for which I'm proud and my wife's proud as well is the culture we'd created and the friends we made along the way amongst the staff. And we went, if you think back, we went through the financial crash and we went through COVID. We went through a lot of difficulties and times when I was waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking, "Oh my God, what have I done?" We're gonna lose everything. We'll be out of house and home because the whole thing's going to go bust. And we had a lot of eggs in that one basket. But we were. Yeah, by the time COVID came along, we were ready to face anything. We very quickly decided it was going to be an absolute disaster. So we sold everything we could, and we closed the hotel right at the beginning of COVID because there's no flights, so you can't open the hotel anything, no flights to the island. But then we reopened in October, and primarily because American flights started coming in, Europeans were not. But we opened in October of 2020 and managed to survive and took on. I mean, the law said we had to make everyone redundant, so we had to take on a big loan to pay everyone's redundancy.
Right.
Nevertheless, we kind of survived, and this was another massive piece of luck. There was a lot of luck all the way down, but a massive piece of luck was that each room at the hotel was almost designed for COVID, so it was open air. Basically, there was no windows, and so the air, it was very well ventilated. There were and every room was an individual building, so it was perfect for COVID. So we were starting to say, this is the place to come during COVID, and we actually did quite well come by January, February of 2021. But that was probably our biggest. Well, COVID and the financial crash were our biggest difficulties we had to face. Yeah, but. I mean, I've got hundreds of stories of crazy things that went on. I think we during the building, we had 5 times we got and I wasn't even aware of it. My partner didn't even tell me this. 5 times we got a stop notice from the Antiguan planning department.
Wow.
Saying you don't have planning permission to do this. And we were due to open in something like September 2006. And they eventually came down and actually stopped us. And then we had to move the restaurant. The restaurant was already built. We had to move the restaurant back because there's planning legislation in Antigua that says you've got to be 100 feet back from the high water mark, and the restaurant wasn't. So we had to take it down and move it back. And we had to break up the swimming pool and build a new one because that was too close to the high water mark as well. So that was that was one of the many, many surprises along the way. And
that's
then,
the risk,
I mean, by that,
right? Yeah. And that's
Sorry?
the risk, right? Everything that you just described.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I always say if I'd had my kind of professional venture capital's hat on, I would never have done it because it was crazy. It was crazy, really, to even try to do what we did. Initially, I thought it was going to be a $250,000 investment. Of course, it didn't. It became much more significant because the the guy who became my partner and I decided that maybe we could do it together. So we did it together. We did the whole funding together, rather than getting a group of people to each doing a $250,000 investment.
Well, you talk about, you go from doing the private equity. You're going in here and call it, like you just said, right? Something that you didn't even expect it to even be more of an investment or an opportunity, whether it was accidental or something you stumbled upon. But then there was a shift, there was a pivot, right? Where you think, okay, and just instead of just throwing money in, instead of just being an investor, now you've got, the partner and yourself and others that are contributing to now growing, building, and the success of running this business, right? And there's a major risk factor that a lot of people don't see behind the scenes, right? They just see, hey, this is a night, for example, the property, wonderful property, great property. But then, there's also the part where how do you sustain it? Right. The vision. You talked about how during COVID times, during, the crisis with the crash, right? There were the challenges and survived it. Talk about that, right? Talk about the resilience, because a lot of people don't know the resilience behind the scenes, with what it takes. Because you could have just easily closed shop, folded, left the keys on the table, right? But you didn't. Right? You're smart about it, and you had the luck with open air rooms, right? Like you said, during COVID time, that allowed you by inspectors and everyone that said, hey, you're going to have these rooms to do it. But what were those things, the resiliency? Because you could have easily just said, I'm done, right? But you didn't.
I think by the time of COVID, it was very different. And we felt we had a responsibility to our family of employees. And so the idea of walking away from it was just not something we felt we could do. And what was a little strange in Caribbean in the way COVID was dealt with was there's no furloughing like in the US or the UK. So you got no support from the government at all. So, and the government made all the hotel owners make everyone redundant. So the employees were supported by the private individuals. That's what the government forced the private individuals to do. But then, in a kind of weird Caribbean way, the equivalent of the central bank said they kind of changed the rules for the lenders about how much equity they had for their loan book. So they allowed the banks to loan to the private individuals who'd given the money to the staff to support them through COVID. The banks actually lent more money to the private individuals. So we got the money we used on the redundancy came from the central bank. So it was kind of a Caribbean mishmash of furloughing, but actually the people who took the tab were the private individuals rather than the government, because the government couldn't afford it, because that's the nature of the government here. We behaved in COVID like this might be the end of everything. We will lose everything here. And we might have to walk away. And you were talking about resilience, but actually, I don't remember or feel a point at which I thought I had the choice, really. And so it was the fact that we were able to open in October and we ran with 25% occupancy. So we were losing money, but we weren't losing so much money that we were going to go bust. And then from there, things picked up. So that wasn't the point where, when looking back, it's quite hard to remember all the anxiety, because
Right.
You often forget the really difficult times. But I think the more challenging time was when we were building and we were going over budget. And like I said, we had the planners stop us when we were meant to be opening. And one of the things that might not be clear to many people is that we had bookings. We had bookings from a year ago, because that's the way Caribbean luxury hotels worked, is that you went out with a contract a year in advance. So every April you went to lots of tour operators with a contract with your new prices for the next year. So we had loads of bookings and no hotel. And so we were going through this daft scenario where we were having to take the money from the individual who'd booked us and then have the tour operator say, look, sorry, they're not going to be open, but here's an alternative hotel, which we had arranged for them. So, but we'd kind of got to a stage where there was no going back. We had to keep going forward because all our money had been invested, and the only way to get any money back was to open. So that was a really challenging time. And even in just before we opened in 2006, I still thought I was going to be an investor. I never thought I was going to be involved in the running of the hotel. And then I came out in November and was carrying sinks up the hill and, finishing off rooms with the construction crew, and realized that someone had to be there to push it over the line. So I stayed and went through Christmas, and we opened just before Christmas. And I stayed in Antigua for Christmas and New Year, and then realized that I had been emotionally swept into welcoming people to what was effectively like my home, So it was that was, when you talk about pivot, that was the pivot, but it was almost like a unconscious one. It wasn't like I'd ever planned to be running the hotel, and suddenly I felt that it was the only option to make everything work, Unfortunately, my partner at the time stepped back and allowed me to kind of grab the thing by the scruff of the neck and open it and get things moving, It was a very strange time, because I had no experience at all.
Well, and then I think, the message I'm hearing too is, like you said, there was things that were unconscious that you just talked about. You also had the sacrifice, right? Here you are, where I love what you said about, I'm taking care of my people, the people that work with me, work for me. They're also people I'm responsible. You just don't want to just turn your back on them. A lot of people wouldn't think like that in a heartbeat, right? Regardless of the financial situation, they just say, they'll tuck tail and run, right? But that is something that's resilience. That's not quitting. And I think that speaks to character. That speaks to, obviously, what you're doing, but more importantly, it's the fact that you cared, right? And that's the whole point with what, we want to share or send our message. I was like, hey, these are people with these experiences, have had things, and obviously the trials and tribulations, but the property is amazing, right? Hermitage Bay, with everything that you've shared with me, and I've yet to visit. But, everything I've always seen on photos, videos, and, and you sharing stuff with me, just amazing. And no, of course, that's why it's successful, but it's the other side of it, the dark side that people don't see when there's impacts that are out of your control. And let me ask you this, Andy, this is an interesting question, right? You obviously, you've gone through a lot. You've done a lot of travels. You've experienced a lot of international business, a lot of things that more than the normal average person, right? If you could go back in time and you wanted to give yourself advice, right? What would be 2 things you would say to your younger self?
I think I would say have the guts to leave the corporate world as early as possible. I was pretty well paid, and it was comfortable, and I remember when I left, when I did my MBA, I really wanted to be an entrepreneur. And then once I'd been working in private equity for a while, I was so well paid and it was so easy. I thought, well, you'd be daft to go out and risk all as an entrepreneur. Might as well, take the easy route. And so I forgot about it completely. And then and even at the point of being made redundant, I still didn't think I wanted to go off and be an entrepreneur. So I guess the message would have been, to my younger self would have been, maybe I could have done that earlier. But I think it was rational at the time. It felt and looking back, it still feels like a very rational decision to take the low risk, very well paid. I mean, I made a lot more money in the corporate world than I made in the entrepreneurial world. But I got a lot more reward in the entrepreneurial world than I did in the corporate world. But it wasn't about money. It was all about other things. It was all about, as you said, the relationship with our family of people. And I've always said that I came as with a first world mentality, and the Caribbean people taught me to be a human being. And that's what's really special about being here in the Caribbean, is that people still know how to caring of others, caring of people in need, looking after your neighbor, looking after guests. It was a really interesting journey from that perspective. And that's, when I look back on my life, about what I've done, it's that journey that is the most important thing to me.
Yeah. And I like what you just said, because the thing that I keep hearing is the value. You found a tremendous amount of value, but also the value in relationships, but also you talked about emotional resilience too, right? You have the people, and I like what you said too, for for the folks listening, right? It's a common thing. A lot of us would always tell our younger selves, hey, you should do something sooner, right? Of course, we're
Yeah.
saying those things. What are two things you would tell younger people, just in general, right? Or people that want to try to start up, they're thinking of going corporate. They are in corporate. They've had a dream to say, I want to venture off to do my own thing. I don't want to be redundant. I don't want to be just part of the chain, right? What would you tell young people today, right? If you had a chance to tell two things to take away from hearing you talk about your stuff today.
I think I'd say it's all about the people. I think all really successful businesses have great people working in them, and they're working there because they're happy and they feel they have a purpose doing what they're doing, and they get their fulfillment they get some of their fulfillment, maybe not all of it, but a lot of their fulfillment through enjoying the job they're doing and feeling that they're doing some good. And so I think that as a younger person, I was not really aware of that. And particularly in the early days in working in the financial world, there was a lot about spreadsheets and return on investment, and not so much thought about the people who achieved, the teams and the people who achieved although we spent a lot of time thinking about who are the people we're backing when we were investing and backing people. And it was about how good they were at motivating their team and doing their job. But I think when I became an entrepreneur, it became much clearer to me how important that side is, in that you can't get, you can tell people what to do, but you can't get them to do a job well unless they really want to. And you have to work out why they want to do that. And if they don't want to work with you, maybe, you've got to change, or they've got to change that.
Yeah, and I would say, Andy, in closing this, right? Like my biggest takeaway from you, which you shared with us today, and you're gracious about, is just it wasn't a shock to me, but the fact that you went in, and I didn't know that necessarily that hey, I wasn't thinking of doing this. It was just something I was going to invest in, and here you are years later running it, right? And I think that speaks to the wisdom and the evolution, right? And Andy, I really want to thank you for being here, because you reminded us today that success isn't just about the numbers in a bank account, right? I think also it's about the courage to clear, your pave your way, right? Your journey from obviously going from London and doing what you're doing in finance, and then now you're here in the hills of Antigua and showing that like the most rewarding paths are often the ones that we have to carve out ourselves. And you did it. You've carved out through those trials, tribulations, successes, and the things that you've done. And for our listeners that are out there waiting for the perfect moment to pivot, remember Andy's story, guys. Sometimes you just have to pick up the tools and start clearing out the brush, right? So Andy, I just want to thank you again for taking the time, out of your busy schedule to talk with me today, to talk with everyone today. And Andy, thank you again so much. And please give our love to the family and to the girls, and look forward to connecting again soon.
Yeah. One thing, a final word is, I think opportunities are floating by us all the time, and you just kind of have to, grab it and have a look at it, and that might become the new step in your life. I think that's how it felt to me. There was no planning in anything I did. It was all a bit of I remember in physics, we used to talk about, I think it was the random walk, about how particles move around in space. And it always felt like that's how my career has been. The opportunities are there. Just grab them.
And the opportunity will be there. And then everyone's just got to make a choice. And Andy, what a journey. I look forward to having you on other ones to talk more, but thank you so much again.
Okay. Thanks.